This is meant to be a rather quick introduction to some of the terms and ideas that we're going to talk about as we discuss unemployment next week. All right. And so we'll be talking about unemployment and taxation in our final two subjects to tackle, maybe a little bit of extra things thrown in, but mostly we're going to be talking about unemployment and taxes. And so I wanted to spend a little time at the very end of this week. Yeah, by this point, you should have taken the test and have all that behind you, to talk about defining some terms, because when you hear unemployment statistics, or you hear a certain number of people unemployed or a certain percentage of people employed, you might be thinking some things that are actually very inaccurate, because these definitions are not layman's definitions. They're economists' definitions, and it's important that we get them down and that we know what we're talking about as we enter into our discussions for next week. So don't sit back, get your notes out, and then sit back and relax a little bit and write down what you need to on these definitions. There are also going to be a couple formulas in here, and I'd like to get this whole video in under 25 minutes. So let's begin and we'll see how we do. All right, so before we talk about why unemployment happens, the causes of it, the impact of it, obviously our discussion of unemployment is very timely right now, considering what's happening in our nation. But we have to define terms. And like I said, these terms are not always as obvious as you might think. So I have here, it's likely that you don't know how specific employment terms are used, and you can make big economic mistakes by not understanding that. So for instance, once you find out what the unemployment rate really means, you're going to perhaps have a very different view of what impacts and changes are when that number changes in an economy. Another thing to understand is that it may help you to set some things right. You know, before I really understood the definitions of these numbers, I would think to myself, boy, it just doesn't really seem to me, and this is back when unemployment rate was about 5%, it doesn't really seem to me that many people work. I mean, I would know so many people that for one reason or another did not work for a living. And once you understand what the employment rate is, and unemployment rate, you'll understand better why those numbers don't really add up, okay? So let's start with some definitions. All right, what does it mean to be employed? Okay, this is how economists, okay, this isn't my opinion, this is how economists define employment, okay? What does it mean to be employed? Number one, you work as a paid employee. If you are a volunteer in an organization and you don't get paid, you are not employed. This doesn't mean that we're making a value judgment about the use of your time, right? We're not defining things emotionally, we're defining things factually. Number two, you work in your own business. So if you are, as they say, self-employed, right? You work unpaid hours in your family business. Now, why does that count? But volunteer hours, you know, or other things. Well, think about it. In a family business, especially a business that's set up like a sole proprietorship, okay, which we didn't go over because it's a micro concept, but a sole proprietorship is like, instead of a corporation, it's that the family business, okay, and the family's income, that's all in the same pot. In other words, the family business is the family's income. So thinking about maybe like a small restaurant, not a chain, okay, but like a small restaurant where someone might work, and you might have family members that work in the business, but they don't get paid. If you think about some local restaurants where Asian families own and operate these stores, and many times their children will be in the restaurant. I can think of two local restaurants, one in Beverly Hills and one right in Hernando, where I have literally pretty much watched their children grow up in the restaurant, where they have been waiting tables or doing counter service, and seen them literally get older and doing their homework. And that is because in some family businesses, family members do work unpaid hours, but it's bringing in income to the whole family. And so if the wife is working in a restaurant, right, and she doesn't necessarily work at hourly wage or even take a paycheck, but the money's coming into the business, then she's considered employed. You work, okay, but you're on vacation, there was just a hurricane, you're sick, okay? You don't become unemployed because you're off for 2 weeks, right? You don't become unemployed. You're on leave, vacation, ill. Those things matter in the statistics. And guys, next week we'll get into looking at some Bureau of Labor and Statistics web pages together. And I mean, boy, they get really specific about this information. So that's why it matters to make the point that, yeah, you're still employed even if you're not working right this very minute. And then you're considered employed whether you are full-time or part-time. Now, as we get into next week, we'll know that the Bureau of Labor and Statistics does make distinctions between part-time and full-time labor. And they also make a distinction in something that's called underemployed, which means that, yes, you're employed, but because you're working only a part-time job and you want a full-time job and you're qualified, you're underemployed. There are specific breakdowns, but right now we're just trying to get the definition of what does it mean to be employed. Yes? Okay, moving on. What does it mean to be unemployed, right? What is the economist's definition of unemployed? Number one, you're laid off from work. Some people are calling that furloughed right now, and you're waiting to be called back to work, right? So you're laid off, but it's been indicated to you that your job will be restored or you will come back online once the business can hire you back, okay? Or you're not working, but, and this is very specific, it's going to seem weird, okay? You're not working, but you're available to work and you want to work and you are looking for work actively sometime in the last 4 weeks. To be unemployed, you have to be looking for work, which is an interesting thing. Sometimes we think like, oh, this person's been, unemployed for 6 years and they don't look for work and no, that's called something else, okay? It doesn't mean you have to find a job within 4 weeks, but it means you have to have been going out, actively looking for work, filling out job applications, conducting a search, okay? Now, this is going to be self-reported largely to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, and so you might say, well, what if people lie? Well, okay, but the point is to try to collect accurate data and make it mean something, okay? So what does it mean to look for work? What are the criteria used to judge whether or not a person is truly looking for work? And how does the Bureau of Labor and Statistics know that you're looking for work? Those are all things we could maybe talk about later. But right now, you're unemployed if you're laid off, okay? Or if you are unemployed but looking actively for work and want to work. If you are unemployed and not doing those things, you're actually in a different category. Okay, what does it mean when we call someone not in the labor force?
How's she doing?
Okay, so what does it mean to be told, well, you're not in the labor force, or to be counted as not in the labor force? Well, not in the labor force simply means people aren't looking. These people are not looking to work. They're not part of the labor force. You're a stay-at-home mother. You're a student, full-time student or part-time student that doesn't work. You are retired. You are a baby, okay? These things mean you're not in the labor force. Now, let me ask a question. Do you think that these people represented in these bullets are counted in unemployment? What is your guess on that? Answer is no. They're not counted in unemployment. And you know why? Because they're not in the labor force. They're not in the labor force. And so therefore, they're not expected to be working. And unemployment is a number that's trying to indicate to us who can't find a job. Are you getting it? That's why the number is semi-useful. We have to subtract the people not in the labor force, because otherwise it looks like no one can get a job, when really there's a large chunk of people, retirees, stay-at-homes, students, babies, children, that aren't working and aren't looking for work, okay? And so they're not in the labor force. All right, let's move on. How about asking ourselves, well, then what is the labor force, right? I get who's not in the labor force, so how do we get to a number of people in the labor force? Well, here it is. There's a little formula. Make sure you write it down, please. Labor force equals the number of employed plus the number of unemployed. So go back to those first two definition slides Everybody that gets paid for their labor, works in a family business without getting paid, full-time or part-time. Remember our first slide? Those are your employed people. And you take that and you add it to the number of unemployed people, people who are laid off and thinking that they're going back to work, and people actively looking for a job in the past 4 weeks and want to be employed and are able to be employed. So babies, no, right? Retirees, no. Number of employed plus number of unemployed are going to give you your labor force number. And we want to know in a society how many people are in the labor force, because that can tell us things like, for instance, remember our old friend, the possibility production frontier graph, and we say, assuming all resources are fully employed? Do we mean by that assuming that we're putting babies on the job, or that we're forcing stay-at-home parents into a factory, or that our retirees are out there working, and that's what we mean by full labor is being brought to bear? No, we mean the labor force, okay? So this helps clarify some of the things that we discussed earlier in the year. All right, so when an unemployment rate is discussed, then what are we talking about? Because it's actually a formulaically arrived, if that's a word, a reality, okay? So when we talk about the unemployment rate, which, by the way, right before the coronavirus hit, was 3.5%. That's a very low unemployment rate. That's a very low unemployment rate. Okay, employment was hot and unemployment was down. Usually economists are pretty happy with the unemployment rate at about 5%. Now, there are some underlying problems here, and they are going to be discussed in terms of labor dropouts. Okay, and we're going to look at that when we have our Zoom meeting. Hopefully, if you guys have read the article, we're going to look at this in an upcoming current event. But we kind of have gotten a little off track on the current events because I gave you an extra week on that culture and leisure. Okay, let's look at the formula. The number of employed divided by the labor force. So how do you find the unemployment rate? You take everybody who is working for a paycheck or working in a family business or working full-time or part-time, right? You divide it by the number of people who could be doing that, right? In other words, they are your laborers. You multiply by 100 and you get the unemployment rate. Why do you multiply by 100? To get a percentage. Guys, listen to me. If I ask you on an upcoming quiz, and we're going to start next week with a quiz on this. Of course, you'll have time to study and review your notes, but I'm going to start on Monday in your work packet with a quiz over these definitions and formulas, okay? When I ask you for an unemployment rate, I want to see a percentage. Still had a couple problems with that. We got much better, but when we last time we're dealing with formulas and GDP. So see how I express this unemployment rate right here? And one second. See how I have my employment rate as a percentage. What percentage of people in America are unemployed? 3.5% before the coronavirus, okay? And so I want to see percentages when you talk about the unemployment rate. I want you to have these two formulas that are very easy to work with, but if you don't memorize them, you're going to get yourself confused. The number of employed divided by the labor force, that'll give you the unemployment rate. One thing that we have not talked about in this slide presentation is the labor dropout rate. What about people who are not unemployed, which means they're not looking for work, they're not laid off, okay, but they're also not, ready, babies, retirees, stay-at-homes, full-time students. So they're not looking for work. They haven't retired. They're not infants or children. They're not home taking care of children. What are these people doing? Okay, well, that's a big question. And that discussion is called the labor dropout rate. The article that I gave you, Where Have All the Men Gone, gives some very interesting thoughts and insights into this topic. And if you've been reading ManQ from time to time or following along in ManQ, there's a whole section in the ManQ text discussing this very topic. And it basically uses the idea of Kramer from Seinfeld as a jumping off point to discuss, like, what is exactly does this guy do for a living? How does he survive? He doesn't appear to go to a job. So what is it that he does? And they use him kind of as a fictitious example of a labor dropout person. And there's a lot of interesting psychological, sociological, perhaps spiritual answers to this question. There are some political and economic answers to this question. We need some solutions to this question. But it's interesting that the labor dropout rate has an awful lot of able-bodied men in it. And that's been a pretty significant societal change in the United States over the past 30 years. So I'd like to discuss that together and continue working through this, and we'll get a lot more into unemployment and its implications and causes. And there's all kinds of types of unemployment, like frictional unemployment, seasonal unemployment, and we'll talk about why people are out of jobs, because there are lots of different reasons. And then we will talk about times when it's really an economic problem. In other words, there's a systemic unemployment and there's something wrong in the economy. There are types of employment where people just leave a job because they're looking for something better and they are unemployed. But that's not the same concern level as when an economy is bleeding jobs. And so we'll get into this and we'll get to talk a little bit more next week. This video was only about 17 minutes long, so you get a nice little break. You can review it and write down things that you missed, and we'll take a quiz on just this amount of information early next week, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.